So, hi, Dr. Andy.
Yeah,
Welcome to the fact session. We're very glad to have you as a part of the session.
I'm glad after a little delay we got going here.
All of the hassle, yes. So before we go ahead into the session, so I want to introduce you to the audience. Okay, so that when they get to watch it, they'll know who you are. So guys, this is Dr. Andrew Galpin, tenured professor in the Center of Sports Performance at California State University at Fullerton. Studied human bioenergetics at Ball State University. He has also studied exercise and sports science at University of Memphis. He has co-authored Unplugged, Evolve from Technology to Upgrade Your Fitness, Performance and Consciousness. He currently focuses his attention on teaching classes, that is in sports nutrition, exercise physiology, designing exercise programs, applied strength and conditioning, athlete assessment and measurement, etc. He also runs the BMEP lab, which studies the acute responses and chronic adaptations of human skeletal muscle in response to high force, velocity, power, and fatigue exercises from the whole body down to individual muscle fibers and even into the individual DNA. And he has done a great many things and has several interests such as competitive weightlifting, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, mixed martial arts. But at a core level, he describes himself as a storyteller and teacher. And we're very glad to have him on What the Fact session today. So,
Oh, it's all an introduction.
yeah. So, Dr. Andy, I know that you're constantly engaged in one or the other research studies. So, I'm a little interested to know what you're currently working on.
Well, we've got a whole bunch of them. You know, at all times you're kind of in different phases for different studies.
Okay.
So we have a study that should be accepted probably today.
Today.
Yeah, where we looked at both fiber type, so fast
Mhm.
twitch versus slow twitch,
Mhm.
and sex, and how that related to the post-exercise anabolic response and things like that. So that's kind of wrapping up, but I think perhaps more of interest to the crowd. We are in the middle of collecting data on an intermittent fasting and muscle hypertrophy study.
Wow. Okay.
So that's driving a lot of our attention right now.
Awesome. That's really interesting, and I'm looking forward to read that research. So, we have very less time, so I'll probably get into the discussion and have some questions here. I have some questions here, so we'll go one by one. So, muscle hypertrophy, which is nothing but the process of adding new muscle and muscle strength, muscular strength. Are they interrelated? Does one thing impact the other, or should they be looked at two different aspects of lifting altogether? So, what's your take on this?
Yeah. So what you're getting at is the interplay between strength and hypertrophy, right? And how these things relate. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Number one, when we look at strength, we have to differentiate. Are we talking about a whole body or whole performance, whole muscle strength, or the individual cell itself? And the reason I say that is because many things go into creating force over an entire human body. The muscle itself is only one component of that. And so I think it's a bit unfair to look at muscle hypertrophy as only the cellular aspect of muscle, but then look at muscle strength as a whole body phenomenon. You're not comparing the same things anymore. So an example or a further explanation would be if you're looking at, say, did your one repetition maximum in the squat go up? Well, that's influenced, of course, by muscle, but by connective tissue, by the nervous system, by technique, by other factors. And so it wouldn't simply be explained. And so there can be confusion understanding the difference here. When we look at muscle hypertrophy, that's only going to be explained by muscle size. There's no other factors there. So it's a bit of an apples to orange comparison. And if you look at then the direct comparison, so the muscle fiber strength, so if you take a muscle out of the leg and put it in a petri dish, and how strong can it contract with? That's a more fair comparison, but the problem is very unrealistic. That's not what most of us really care about. It's not what we really do, and I think it's probably silly because that's not really how the system works. And so I think the answer is actually quite clear. I know a lot of people debate this, but I think most of it's foolish. They're talking generally past each other, and they're not really trying to be fair with the conversation. So if you don't think there's any relationship between size and strength, muscle hypertrophy and strength, then why would we ever have a weight class sport? It's very clear there is. Now, is that relationship 100% linear? So for every pound of muscle you put on, does that mean you put on the same X amount of strength? No, of course not. And why would you think there would be that exact relationship? That's silly as well. Want evidence? This is why we have corrective factors for weight class based sports, because the smaller people will always be much stronger relative to the heavier people. So, for example, in weightlifting, I have an athlete right now who is 49 kilos, and she can clean and jerk double her body weight. Okay. Now, if you go to the heavyweight females, and she's an Olympian, you would never see somebody in the highest weight class female clean and jerk double body weight. It'd be absurd, right? It'd be so many kilos beyond a world record. It'd be crazy. And so, is that relationship between size and strength linear, 1-to-1? No, of course. But does that mean there's no relationship at all? Well, that's also equally silly. And so clearly there is some relationship here between the two, but it's not perfect. So I don't think it's that confusing. What happens here if you put on true muscle hypertrophy, meaning you increase the size or the amount of contractile properties in the muscle cell itself, that is going to relate to some improvement in strength. Now, there's a difference, though, because one thing we haven't even talked about with strength is biomechanics. And so if you increase the size of a muscle, you possibly are also changing what's called pronation angle. So this is the angle at which the muscles kind of lay into the bone. And that changes the force velocity profile. And if I kind of lost you there, all I'm really saying is the efficiency or inefficiency of the muscle to pull a bone is going to change when you change the amount of mass in the bone. And so you have a lot of factors to consider there. But if you have more contractile proteins, which is what we would define hypertrophy as, you're most likely you have a potential to create more force. And so that would be the most straightforward explanation between those two. I'm happy to go into further of any of those aspects if you want, or if you have other questions, you can move on.
Okay. So there is a relation between muscle hypertrophy and strength, but we cannot really establish directly that with increasing, probably someone having a lot of muscle will also have a lot of strength or something like that. We cannot really say that, right?
Well, they can. So here's what you can say. If you take a really highly trained, strength trained person and say they are 75 kilos,
okay,
and they're really, really strength trained, and they train a lot, they've been training for 5 years. Well, just because you find somebody who's 100 kilos randomly on the street who doesn't exercise and doesn't lift weights, that 100 kilo person is not going to be stronger than 75 kilo. And that's not an example of there's no relationship. That's an example of they're not trained. When you equate it for training, though, most likely, and this is a numbers game, right? Not always, but most likely, the 100 kilo person will be stronger than the 75 kilo person if they both have equal experience, equal training background. Again, not every single person, because there are exceptions. Some people are just different, but most of the time that person who has more muscle will be stronger than there. So I think that's the most fair way to explain it. Then there are exceptions. I mean, I have an athlete, another female. She competes at somewhere in the neighborhood of what would be 52 kilos, 53 kilos here, and she can deadlift almost 5 times her body weight.
Wow. Okay.
So she's insane. She's absolutely insane. But she's an exception, right? So you could find plenty of girls that weigh 3 times her and can't deadlift half her weight. But that doesn't prove the point. So the point would be proven in her sport, people that weigh 70 kilos always outlift her because they're equated for training. So again, I don't see I don't think it's honestly that complicated of a concept, and I don't know why people are so interested in trying to disprove the idea because they can point out one person that doesn't fit the rule. Those are typically, like Steffi in this example. She's the exception that actually proves the rule. Like, she's the oddball out. She's the red herring.
She's an outlier.
Yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
Yeah. So moving on
And
to
outliers are awesome. They're fun as shit.
Yes. So moving to the next question. So how differently males and females should train for muscle hypertrophy and muscular strength as well? So how should the training regime differ between a male and a female?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I don't think we have any answer scientifically. I've spent a reasonable amount of time on this, actually, and we have a male and female wing for our current study, so we're going to see there. But I can tell you what's typically said. What people typically say is women handle volume better, and men will respond better to higher intensity, but can't handle it as often, so they'll break down sooner. But I don't know if that's honestly necessarily really been demonstrated very well scientifically. I feel like every coach I've ever talked to says that same thing, and they all agree. So it makes me think it's probably true, but we don't have strong evidence to show, hey, for hypertrophy, women need higher rep ranges or women need total volume. Again, I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying we don't have like a really solid scientific basis that says like, yeah, this has really been demonstrated a lot to be really robustly true. What I can tell you is from the muscles perspective, people tend to say things like women are more slow twitch and men are more fast twitch. And if you look across the research, that seems to be true when women are untrained. But as women become experienced, there is no difference. And I've biopsied hundreds of men and women now, and I've isolated probably getting close to 100,000 muscle cells at this point. And honestly, we don't see a difference in fiber type between men and women when they're both at the same physical training status. So I don't think it's necessarily true that's the only explanation for why. But again, having said that, I ask every female that comes in the same question, and they all generally do tend to say, yeah, we give more reps to the women, they recover better from the more reps. The men get the higher intensity, but they can't handle as much. So that's about the best. And I would say the same is that's generally true for strength. Is kind of what I'm speaking. And I mean, there is some literature for hypertrophy, but again, I don't think it's been so well established that we have a clear answer scientifically for either strength or hypertrophy differences between the genders. And the last piece I'll add to this is I can speak about this from the nutrition perspective because this is what I do deal with a lot. And in terms of nutritional needs, I honestly find a bigger difference from person to person than I do sex to sex. So I would probably think, honestly, the programming for hypertrophy and strength is the same, where I think if you just pick two random people are so different from each other. Their needs for hypertrophy, rep ranges, or volume, or their differential needs for strength training, it's a bigger difference just selecting two random people than it is men versus women. So I think when you go to coach, when you go to work with yourself, I wouldn't worry, and I don't worry as much about like, are you man or are you woman, as I do like, you're just a different person. So we got to figure out what really works for you. And so you might say, okay, you're a woman, so I think you might work better with higher, and you're man, so I think you might work better less. But really, the person-to-person differences are more impactful than just the sex-specific differences, if that makes sense.
Awesome. So it's more individualistic rather than generalization between male and females, basically, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So I've also come across one of the study which investigated how much of the whole muscle is, how much of type 1 and type 2 fibers are present in advanced power lifters, and they found out that they have pretty even split of type 1 and type 2 fibers in their body. So what's your take on this? Is it true, or is it really something which...
For powerlifters?
Sorry?
For powerlifters?
Yeah.
Specifically? Yeah, so we have a study that we just finished and got out that we published on that. If you look at most of the research, it's going to say that powerlifters tend to be about 50-50, but I'll have to caution you because the methodologies in those studies are not poor, but they're just, we know they're not optimal for the fiber typing thing. So I have still seen very few, if any, studies in powerlifters that actually examined fiber type with the optimal precision. In addition, the studies tend to be extremely small sample size, like 4 subjects, and they tend to be not very high level powerlifters. So the study we just finished and have published, we had 12, 6 men, 6 women, and they were, had a year of powerlifting experience. So, like, not exactly world beaters here. We kind of call them powerlifters because they compete in powerlifting, but it's not like they had been competing for 8 years. And so, I don't know, this just happens to be people who signed up for a powerlifting meet, rather than it is like powerlifters per se. And I don't mean to just give you no confidence at all in our study. But some of them have been training more, but the bar isn't exactly super high, because what I can say is, if you compare that to our study we published last year on weightlifters, Olympic weightlifters. Now, this was with very high precision analysis methodology, and the athletes were very high level. So these were world caliber Olympians and things. They showed they showed the highest percentage of pure 2A fast twitch fibers ever documented in the research. So if you look at the differences between powerlifting and weightlifting in terms of like strength training, that they're actually incredibly similar. So it wouldn't make any sense for me for weightlifters to be 70, 80, 90% fast twitch, and then powerlifters to be 50-50. The training isn't that different. It's close enough to where they should be similar. So I don't really think that's true. I think it's just kind of an artifact of people really haven't studied that area enough. And what I can also tell you is, with our weightlifter studies, when we compared our elite world caliber individuals to our just like national caliber ones, the national caliber ones had significantly lower fast twitch fibers. And so I do think it matters the caliber of athlete you're talking about. And training experience mattered for that matter. So those folks that were higher in training experience tended to have more fast twitch fibers than those ones that didn't. So, sorry. Yeah.
So this brings to you the next question, which is fiber-specific hypertrophy. So what's your take on this? Should we really target fast twitch fiber training and slow twitch fiber training? And do we really have to target a certain rep ranges? And is it going to amplify the results? And recently there was one research study, which says resistance exercise-induced changes in muscle metabolism are load dependent, where they investigated training at 30% 1RM, 80% 1RM to failure, volume equated conditions. And they found that same type 1 and type 2 hypertrophy is seen in both the cases. Now, there is a limitation. It was performed in untrained individuals, beginners. But do you think the results will be consistent in experienced lifters, or is it going to be different in this case?
Yeah, so in this case, we have some reasonable indirect evidence that it's possible that a fiber type specific rep range does exist. We've got 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 studies now. They're all sort of pointing to that. But you set it up very well and said, this is assuming you have some training background. If you're untrained, the responsiveness is so high, it doesn't really matter what you do for hypertrophy's sake. Now, don't interpret that as meaning your programming doesn't matter at all. You should really pay attention to your programming and be smart and progress over time and really build a solid foundation with untrained people. But in terms of just getting a hypertrophic response for over 8 weeks, it's that part won't matter per se with somebody who's very untrained. So yeah, I mean, I would say that the science has not been demonstrated clearly yet that a fiber type specific range exists, but I wouldn't be surprised if it came out and it showed that is the case. Now that's a little bit different question than should we train differently. So we could dive into that if you'd like, but just talking about is it possible physiologically, I think it's reasonable to say, hey, there might be something here, to think that the fast twitch fibers hypertrophy more with a lower rep range, 5 to 10 reps per set or something. And slow twitch fibers are going to respond more specifically to the higher rep ranges, 20 to 30 reps per set or something. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that. I mean, I could go over sort of the evidence, but one of the ones that's most compelling, and we've seen this very clearly in the hundreds of thousands of fibers between my lab and my previous lab, that, for example, most people, if they're untrained, their fast twitch and slow twitch fibers are sometimes the same in size, and sometimes the fast twitch fibers are larger. If you're strength trained, almost always the fast twitch fibers are larger. But if you're heavily endurance trained, it's the opposite. The slow twitch fibers are most of the time larger than the fast twitch fibers. So that's with traditional endurance training, cycling, swimming, jogging, these types of things. That's not with just higher rep range strength training. But that's really a question that really has been answered. So if you just follow the logic, it's very clear that slower contractions consistent over long periods of time do tend to induce either slow twitch hypertrophy or fast twitch atrophy. My guess is with the endurance training, it's actually the latter. It's just you're atrophying the fast twitch fibers so much because they're not being activated, right? They're just not ever seeing activation because these folks do anything heavy or fast. But it wouldn't be out of the world to then say, okay, well then maybe it is a higher rep range, something 20, 30, 40, 50 reps, muscular endurance type of training would preferentially target the slow twitch fibers, and because there is now some resistance, then it could preferentially hypertrophy those fibers. So I don't think it's out of the question to think that that's possible. I think the more interesting thing is, okay, then should you train for it? Well, that's a fun conversation, but it's not super straightforward.
Okay, that's interesting. So this brings. So I'll ask the next question directly, and this is related to the training volume. So people used to follow this earlier definition, which is training volume load, that is load into number of sets into reps, and there was no clear relation between that volume definition with the hypertrophy. So they came the next definition, which is set volume, the number of sets per muscle per. So we know volume is the primary variable which drives the muscular growth. So there are some of the studies which try to establish a relation between the number of sets you perform per muscle group per week with muscle hypertrophy, and one of the most common and most popular one is the Brad Schoenfield study. So my question is, what is your suggestion to a beginner or an advanced lifter or an experienced lifter on how many sets they should be performing to maximize muscle hypertrophy?
Oh, what a great question. I like how you set that up too. Look, if you get Brad on here, I mean, Brad's a good friend. We've done projects together. We've actually collaborated with some studies, and we have some grants that we're collaborating on. Mm-hmm. But if you bring him in, I think he'd probably give you a direct number and answer. I won't. I'm not nearly as confident in those things that he is. I've just worked with too many people to realize that I always get really nervous or apprehensive when people say maximize or optimize. It just doesn't really exist in humans. Can you do it better? Well, possibly, but man, honestly, I don't think, I'm of the believer, I don't think hypertrophy training is that complicated in terms of programming. I don't think it is. The work is hard. The dedication, the training is hard. But I think it's not that difficult to reach a maximal threshold for hypertrophy stimulus. And I think you can get there in a lot of different ways. I think you really, really, really can get there in different ways. So I don't think like being that precise with your programming is the answer we want to get after. I typically would say, are you use all the metrics? So are you growing in your metrics? Are you improving? Are you recovering? How are other life stressors getting you? Okay, we'll try to handle more. Throw some more volume out there and see what happens. Do they stop? Do they stall? Do they go backwards? I've just been around a lot of weightlifters And like we always have a number of like reps per set, tonnage we want to get to per week, per month, per year, per quad. So for the Olympic athletes, it's 4-year sort of numbers. But I mean, the numbers are like, well, we want to hit something like 50,000 to 80,000 reps. Well, that's a giant range. So I think hypertrophy is kind of the same thing where I don't necessarily know. I mean, obviously, that higher trained you get, you can add more to that, but it depends on so many factors. I could see two people who, one person is smoked after 30 sets and one person smoked after 6 sets. So I think it's just really hard, in my opinion, to put like real numbers on. Okay, if you're untrained, do this much. If you're trained, do this. If you're moderately trained, do this much. So I have a hard time answering you that one, giving you a specific number. I'll let Brad do it because I know what he'll say. I know what his answer is. But
all right. So next, what the fact session is anyways with Dr. Brad. So probably I'll throw in this question.
is it really?
Yes, yes. All right. So
Okay.
I'll
Well, when he comes on, tell him that I think all hypertrophy training is fake and it's all a bunch of nonsense. And tell him that I said you absolutely have to get protein in within 4 minutes of training, or it doesn't count at all. And that hypertrophy research is a giant waste of funding. So tell him those things.
oh, sure. I'll pass on the message. All right, so I'll move to the next question. Again, we have research from Brad and team on this aspect. High load versus low load for muscle growth and strength. So, what do you think is better, a high load training or low load training uh, for muscle growth as well as muscle strength?
Yeah, for muscle growth, I don't think it matters too much. In fact, I'll argue. Actually, Brad, I think pretty much agrees with me on this one too. That if you're trying to optimize hypertrophy, especially if you're thinking more long term, you're thinking past just the next 6 weeks. You're thinking 6 months, a year, 5 years down the line. You want to have as much muscle as you can. You want to maintain it for as long as you can as you get into your 30s, 40s, 50s. I would argue that you should train over a large repetition range. You should maximize variety in all of your training. The stimulus, the type of contraction, the movement pattern, the actual exercise, the implements, so machines, barbells, dumbbells, all these things, the rep range, all this stuff. Now, before I go on, like, to be very careful there, I'm not at all suggesting random, just like go to the gym and do random shit. Not even close. Have a plan. Variation is different than randomization, right? Have a plan, have a purpose, have intent, have a program, but just make sure your program is changing some variation somehow along the way, right? If not, if you just sort of do the same 12 exercises and you do those ad nauseum, and you're always between 8 to 12 reps per set, and you're always doing 3 to 5 sets per, that's going to be pretty limited. So have a plan, but I do want people to move outside of, oh, I'll only use dumbbells, or I only use machines, or I only do these sets, or I only do this style of training, this program periodization. So having said that, so for hypertrophy, that's all saying, like, it's not that hard programming wise. It's pretty idiot proof. You can kind of do either one of those, high load, low load, as long as you're taking it to the same relative level of fatigue, right, or damage. Which those are not the same things, but they carry over. In terms of strength, that one's a lot easier because if you don't add load, you don't get strong. It's just not going to happen, right? And I don't know how many blood flow restriction training studies we need, how many sets of 30 studies we need, and they're all going to show basically the same thing. So you might have equal hypertrophy, but you're not going to get strong. And that follows every line of physiology, every line of logic, every line of specificity, and every line of coaching knowledge that we've ever had. That unless you're untrained, it's pretty hard to get strong when you don't lift something heavy or move something heavy.
On a short-term perspective, on a short-term duration, yes, the load doesn't really matter for muscle hypertrophy. But how important do you think a lifter has to get stronger to add muscle in a long-term perspective? Like I'm talking
well, it's
about.
never going to hurt you.
Sorry?
It's never going to hurt you, right? So what's Mark Bala always say? Strength is never weakness. Weakness is never strength. Yeah, it's not going to help you to be weaker. It's not going to hurt you to get stronger. And of course, getting stronger will allow you to move higher loads. It'll allow you to handle the loads better. It'll hopefully improve connective tissue and joint integrity, which will allow you to probably handle more volume over time. So, and again, this is just even further why I say, if you're thinking about this for the long term, not just trying to look good in 4 weeks from now, then you would need that even pure strength, even that 1 rep max, that 2 rep max, 3 rep max strength, because that's more variation. That's going to target fiber types and individual muscle fibers that are not even targeted at, say, reps of 5 or reps of 6 to 8. So there are still some small subset of neurons that are not turned on until you really get to that 1 rep or 2 rep or 3 rep. So from a hypertrophy perspective, those might only respond to extremely heavy training. And so if you don't train them, that you're never going to get the size increase in those fibers, which would limit your overall size increase. So from just even directly a muscle hypertrophy standpoint, I would argue that at least some points, that level of pure strength training has to be a part of the program, let alone what you were kind of getting at, which is, well, just fundamentally getting stronger allows us then to handle loads that we couldn't handle, which allows us to put intensity on the muscle that we couldn't get to before, which would allow us to develop hypertrophy later into our training age, which is always something good. And then, of course, functionally being stronger is always basically always a benefit. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons we could come up with why you would want to make sure you continue to get stronger. And to be clear, this is not arguing you need to chase the highest 1 rep max possible. What it is arguing, though, is if you never do anything below 5 reps per set or below 8 reps per set or whatever your thing is, that's going to be a limitation eventually. It's going to be a problem. So that's really what I'm saying.
All right. Okay. So we should be training, of course, in the lower range also, so that you actually turn on some of the neurons and the muscle fibers attached to it, right? Yes.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right. So this, this will help us answer a few of the other questions which I listed here. So I'm not really going into those questions. So I'll move to the next question altogether. Periodization. Is it really required for hypertrophy? What are the advantages of periodizing the training?
Yes, I believe 100% is required. But it comes down to semantics a bit. So what do you mean when you say periodization? So in my mind, periodization is the intentional manipulation of one of your 7 modifiable variables over time. If you are not manipulating something over time, you're going to have major problems and you will not hypertrophy. So do you have to do a linear program? No. Do you have to do an undulating program? No. I don't think when people think of periodization, they tend to think of these strength training periodization approaches. But you don't have to do that. But that's not really what periodization means. Again, it refers to the 7 modifiable variables. So that could be volume, intensity, rest intervals. It could be how you progress over time. It could be the exercises you select. It could be any of those things, right? Something has to progress over time. And periodization is just the intentional manipulation of one of those 7 so that you can continue to progress over time. I do not believe anyone would maximize their hypertrophy or get closer to maximizing their hypertrophy without intention behind all of that. And that actually it's kind of referred to going back to what I said earlier. So something has to change. The difference is some folks will just do something different every 4 or 5 weeks. Okay, that's fine. That's better than doing nothing. But now that's almost back to just randomization. It's not variation. So periodization is intentional variation. So it's looking at your 5 weeks of training or whatever, your 6 weeks or your 8 weeks, however long you kind of like to conceptualize your training and going, okay, do I want to make a change in my volume? This could be total volume. It could be reps per set. It could be total sets. Lots of ways to play with volume. No, do I want to keep that the same? Do I want to change intensity? Yes, no. Do I want to just manipulate my rest intervals? Maybe I want to go to long rest intervals so I can increase the amount of work I can do. Or maybe I want to go to short rest intervals, which reduces the intensity and or the volume, but increases metabolic challenge. Okay, maybe I want to just influence and change the type of exercise. So I want to do more eccentric work, or I want to do more pause work, or I want to do, again, machines this time, or I want to go to free weights only, or or whatever I want to do. Do I want to manipulate my frequency, right? So I've been going to the gym and kind of doing chest 2 days a week, and now I want to go to actually 5 days a week. I'll do the same total volume, but I'll cut it in half and split it over more sessions. Or the opposite, right? Do you want to have some sort of progression with frequency? So there's lots of ways you can play with it, but there should be intent. It shouldn't just be random. It should look at it and say, okay, what did I do the last, again, 4 to 8 weeks, or whatever you like to conceptualize? So what do I want to do the next 4 to 8? Okay, then what's coming after that, and what am I looking at for the year, and what am I trying to get at the end of this year? And you don't have to write out the reps per set for the entire year and the actual workouts, but you should have a conceptual framework of going, okay, this year I'm going to try to build volume, and so I want to get my muscles more used to this so that next year I can do a higher volume at a higher intensity. But I can't just do that by lifting more weights and doing more reps. I'm going to burn out. So this year I'll address foundation, I'll address connective tissue, and I'll really get my conditioning high so that next year I can do higher intensity stuff and it won't beat up my joints so much. Or whatever the hell the case is. I'm just making stuff up kind of as I'm going. But that level of intention is what we should get there. So yeah, I think you absolutely have to periodize your training in some aspect for hypertrophy, or your hypertrophy results will be short, and I believe your training career will be short because of injuries.
So, but what's your opinion about going with a constant load approach? You're not changing anything for someone who's a beginner, who's new to the gym, is walking into the gym for the first time. Do you think it's something advisable, or do you think we should periodize in those cases as well?
Well, look, you have to be realistic too, right? So, yeah, like this person's showing up, and they're 30, 35 years old, and they've never really exercised. I mean, I'm probably not writing out every rep of every set of every exercise for 8 weeks. I'm realistic. That's not going to happen. At that point, I'm honestly, my focus is different things. It is, can we move really well? Can we get technique down? Can we build a base? Can we build a connective tissue up? Things like that. And so I think a simple program is fine there, where it's just sort of like, here's the program, and next week we'll do the exact same program, we'll go a little heavier. The week after that, we'll do a little heavier, or whatever the case, where you're just, it's the exact same program, you're just slowly building load over time. But that works because you start at such a low load. I mean, you're really honestly starting these folks at 30%, 35% of their 1 rep max, right? And so you have room to just go up for 6 weeks. If you're starting someone off at 3 sets of 8 to 12 reps per set at 70%, there's just not a lot of room to go, right? Because you're fairly trained. So yeah, I think you can. It's fine. As long as the intention of when coaching, again, is, in my opinion, let's make sure they're moving really well, and let's make sure their body is responding, that they're getting the sort of adaptations they need to have a long, successful experience with physical activity and strength training. So for the untrained person, I'm honestly not so concerned about the optimal program design. That's never in my mind. My mind, when someone walks in like that, is, how do I set them up so that this becomes now something to do the rest of their life? This is really my intent. I want them to see results. They're incentivized really quick. I want them to learn the basic foundation stuff so that they can continue to do this the rest of their life, because that person, my eye is on 12 months from now. My eye is on 12 years from now. Like, I want this to be like, oh yeah, I started with this trainer, I fell in love with it, and like, I got a little sore, but it wasn't that bad, and things stopped hurting. My back stopped hurting as much, and I started losing a little bit of weight. My energy came back, and all of a sudden, 6 months from now, like, damn, my arms got big, and like my legs, whatever they're looking for, and the hypertrophy will come. But I'm not interested in a debate over optimal program design for the first person's 6 weeks of strength training, because I don't think that's the stuff that you should be concerned about anyways.
All right. So I have 2 more questions, and I'll end the session after this. The first one is a little longer. The second one is going to be very simple, very small question. So I'll straight away go to the question. So we have evidence in the aspect of training till failure, if it's required or not required. And in fact, there is evidence which states that leaving 1 to 3 reps in reserve is going to be really beneficial. Now, are these recommendations good for hypertrophy or strength or both? So what's your take on this?
Yes, so I would say I don't have a huge take on this. This is not an area that I've spent a lot of time on. What I can say for hypertrophy, we'll say, I can offer two pieces of opinion on this. I do see that there is limited futility in training to an absolute maximum every day. I've done that personally. I've been around that a lot. That's a short game. It's not going to work. But do I think it's never reasonable to like just put everything you got into a training session? No, I think that's fine sometimes. But there's people who can speak on this topic specifically much more eloquently from science and experience wise than I can. So I'll give the pass to those folks. In terms of strength, I would say the same thing. Look, with the powerlifters and weightlifters that I work with, it depends on a lot of factors. Depends on, are they going up in a weight class? Are they even concerned about a weight class? Are they cutting calories because they have to make weight? You start going down in calories because you're trying to make in your weight class. You have to pay attention to what's happening in the gym then. So if you put everything you have into the gym and you don't have enough calories, well, let's expect what's going to happen tomorrow. Like this is not all going to be there. So let's be a little bit more intelligent about when we're trying to use those things. And this is where I think things like Prelipin's chart were great, or like they're reasonable to use. It's just like, okay, how many total reps in this month do we want to hit at 90% or higher? Okay, so then if we save one today, does that allow us to get two more tomorrow? Well, probably. And so over the density of the month, that's probably going to result in better strength tomorrow. But the opposite, is weight irrelevant, right? Are you packing on 1,000 calorie surplus a day? And are you able to use anabolic steroids? Okay, well then now we have totally different conversations. So those folks, I was like, well, they don't have to worry so much about reps in reserve because they're going to be able to really get recovery. Do you have access to massage and all of these advanced recovery techniques all day? Are you then leaving in the gym and working for 12 hours? I think these all change it quite a bit. So, but yeah, in general, what I would say is it is quite clear the relationship between hypertrophy and damage is not linear. So, going to 7 out of 10 versus 9 out of 10 is probably going to result in about the same amount of hypertrophy. And so you could question the futility of going those extra 2 reps. And that I would disagree with you there. So those would generally be my positions. My only backside to all this is I have seen people use this as an excuse to not really get after it in the gym. And so let's be careful there. If you're untrained, I'm totally fine with being a little bit more cautious and moving people slower. But if you're pretty trained and you're just like, yeah, that was like a 7 out of 10. You're like, okay, well, if you never go past a 7 out of 10, don't ever expect to get 7 out of 10, more than 7 out of 10 results. You have to move some shit sometimes. So like with the competitive weightlifters, pretty much weekly, they're going to go up to a max. I mean, I'm talking 0 reps in reserve. They're training twice a day, most days a week. So you don't expect to break a world record in squatting if you just only go to 7 out of 10 in squat every time. That's going to be pretty tough. So it's just a lot of factors go into who we talking to, what's the goal, what phase are we in. I mean, right now we've got 8 months until the Olympics. So why would we be reps in reserve now versus in 3 months from now versus 6 months from now? You better believe there's going to be plenty of days where we're going to go leave it all right here. Let's see what you got. So now there'll be plenty of days we'll say leave 2 in the tank, whatever. So it's just about being intelligent when you dose those things. But you shouldn't, I guess, most people shouldn't never do it, and people shouldn't always do it either. So let's just be intelligent. We understand. We call it going to the curtain. So I want you to see where that curtain is of hey, I went past the curtain and now I'm dead for a week. Okay. So I want you to see that curtain. I just want you to touch it though. I don't necessarily need you to go head force through it all the time. But if you don't reach your hand out there sometimes and see where that curtain is, sometimes your hand's going to go through it and we're going to be like, oops, well, shit, that cost us 3 days. But I got to know where your range is. So we have to hit it sometimes.
Okay. That's interesting response. And so this brings me to the last question. And this is a fun question, and I think most of the people who are going to watch this are going to take out something from this. So if you have to pick 3 best performance enhancing supplements, the natural supplements, what would those be? And this is specifically for a strength athlete who's looking to lift heavy weights.
So 3 most effective supplements for a strength athlete.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're going to have a hard time beating creatine.
Creatine.
I could probably just stop right there. I mean, that's going to give you the bulk of your answers. And also depends on what you define a supplement to be. Um, you know, so a lot of people say protein powder in this one, but there's no need to go to protein powder if your protein's sufficient. But you can. So, like, I'll kind of throw that one out to the side. Magnesium tends to have a pretty good effect in these individuals. So, a lot of folks benefit from magnesium. And then it comes down to kind of individual issues. So, we're all pretty aware that most people are low in vitamin D. And so when you put vitamin D in folks, it tends to have a pretty pronounced effect. So that can be very, very helpful for a strength athlete. But we could also take a different twist. It could be caffeine. Now, like caffeine is not a massive player in strength training, but like be around people that are really strong. It helps. So, but it may like that's really low compared to creatine, right? Like creatine would be the probably the number one, and then even magnesium. Like I'm not the hugest proponent of magnesium, but it seems to be pretty clear that that's a benefit, and a lot of the individuals I work with are going to take magnesium supplements during some phases. So those would probably be the ones that I would jump out to for strength athletes. I can't think of any other ones that really would be like, oh, these are game changers. That would be ubiquitous, right? So any game changer would be because you have an individual difference that you are deficient in or something. But the ones that I'm pretty much like, a strength athlete comes to my door, I'm really thinking, oh, it's creatine, and where's your vitamin D and how's your magnesium? Those are probably the ones we're at.
People are pretty scared of taking creatine because there was one research which says it has effect on hair loss, right?
Yeah. So, okay, I'm just gonna cut you off here. Number one, don't worry about it at all. Number two, we're actually we're trying to get close to starting a study on that right now. So, with the like Legion, those guys. So, they're funding some work right now. I was going to look at it, but all I can say is, look, we have now hundreds of studies on creatine. Hundreds, if not thousands. It's probably closer to 1,000 or more. And one had a very poor association between hair loss. So, I mean, you tell me the percent that you're interested in. I've never ever seen it experienced. It's never been shown scientifically other than this one particular poorly designed study. So, if you don't want to take it, fine. Stay weak. Fine with me.
All right. So I'm done with the questions, Dr. Andy. Thank you so much for your valuable answers, and I'm sure we have learned a lot of things today through this session. And would you like to give any message to our viewers, to the audience?
Yeah, I'm bummed we didn't get to do a live Q&A. That would have been fun.
Yeah, but Facebook unfortunately has taken out that feature of adding a person to the live video. It was there till yesterday. We even did a trial run, but it's unfortunate they took out the feature.
Yeah.
All right.
So I guess the parting message I'll have on your friends here, in my experience, and I can say personal experience here because I did the same thing. If you like strength training and you like hypertrophy and you like getting stronger, the mistake I see really often in this community is sort of forgetting what you can get away with when you're 22. All right, so when you're 22 or 26 years old, a lot of the things that us old people are telling you and science is telling you, you look at it, because I did, and I'm like, this isn't true at all. Why? Because I do this and I'm not getting hurt. And then like the 30-year-olds and the 40-year-olds and the 50-year-olds who told me when I was 20, don't do this, I'm telling you, you're going to get hurt. And I was like, whatever, you're just weak. Well, now I'm that person. Now I'm like, damn it. All right. You're right. So try to learn from us like I didn't learn from the people before me. And like most people, won't learn from the people before them. But these things do matter. So I'm not saying be cautious. I don't want you to be more timid in your training. I'm just saying think about the bigger picture sometimes. So don't. What I say is don't play the short game all the time. So sometimes play the long game too. All right. This doesn't mean taking training sessions off, but this does mean things like, again, you can't just show up and blast your biceps 4 days a week to infinity and nothing else. Like, you're going to pay. Your shoulder's going to be wrecked by the time you're 30. Your neck's going to be there because you're not in the right position, or your pelvis is fine now, but if you don't learn how to use and sequence your glutes and your hamstrings and your spinal erectors, if you continue to train over the course of the years, many of you are going to pay for that. So all the little stuff that you feel like doesn't matter at all, and people like, oh yeah, they say that, but I don't really feel anything different. Trust me and trust us. There is a reason we're saying it. So learn movement skills, learn proper sequencing. If you do invest that time now, you'll be able to train just out of your mind for the rest of your life and get crazy results. But build that foundation first. So have a little bit more patience with your training. So the adage that we say is just because you can lift it doesn't mean you should. So a little more patience with the progression.
Thank you so much for the message, and we'll be ending this session now. And thank you so much for doing this session. Really, we're very glad you are doing this for us.
My pleasure, man. It's great to connect.
It's nice talking to you. You have a good night.
All right, see you, buddy.